a hiring manager may not fully understand why I think they need to make an offer to an individual, because from their perspective, which is different, they may be thinking about the results in the next 3 months. They may be thinking about the workload in the next 3 months, and they may be thinking about the level of capability they need in that next 3 months. Whereas I'm actually thinking about the next 9 to 12 months. I'm thinking about that person's growth potential, how they, can deliver maybe 65, 70, 75% of the deliverables we're looking for now, and their growth potential to hit that sort of 100%. And equally, I'm thinking about the overall kind of cultural fit. So it's like I say, the perspectives may be different, but I think there does need to be that respect for us to get to a point where we can make a final decision that is fully considered.
Hello and welcome to Better Conversations with me, Sehaam, Cyrene. If you're hiring talent, or for that matter, if you're interviewing for a job currently, then listen on. How do you know through conversation if someone is a good fit for your team and your company, both now and into the future? Well, I'm talking with talent acquisition project manager Glenn Martin. Glenn talks to a lot of people, candidates and hiring managers. Companies bring him in to find great talent and to create the best hiring experience. So from reviewing CVs to the interview, making us an offer, onboarding us, and then once we've joined the company, how we can grow and what career paths are open to us. He works with several companies at a time to help them make smart hiring decisions fast, which is no small challenge because people, we, are sometimes unpredictable and sometimes surprising. And there's often a gap he's helping to bridge between what a company is looking for in a new hire and what that particular individual could offer beyond the immediate need they'll be fulfilling, beyond the first 3 to 6 months. So, how does Glenn influence who gets that job offer and what influences his own decision making? That's all in this episode, including what he does to put you at ease at interview. But first, how did someone who studied sports science find himself in talent acquisition?
Yeah, great question. So, with regards to the degree, for me, it was really a focus around getting into kind of coaching. I did enjoy biomechanics during the course of my degree, but to actually really get any further in that, I had to do a PhD, and that just wasn't an option for me at the time. So I kind of left with a good degree, and and actually a really close friend of mine kind of made a proposition, which was, if you give me 12 months, I'll give you a job. And at the time, I was slightly reserved about the idea of kind of office work. And he said, "Look, I genuinely believe that you'd be good at this role because you're a people person." And I kind of went into it with a level of skepticism. And then 14 years later, I'm still very much active in the recruitment and talent acquisition space. So thank you to him for
Yeah.
He was
So
absolutely
he was right.
So yeah, he was absolutely right, and remains a very close friend now.
Fantastic. And one of the things I asked you about was, how do you need to influence people in the work that you do? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, influence for me is really around, that provision of actually good quantifiable information, thinking more broadly about the context, and then offering them my experience from a people perspective. Because I think with certain key stakeholders, whilst their seniority level within the business is key to consider, how hands-on or close to the kind of recruitment process through their career can differ. So they may have different experiences. They may have quite siloed experiences. And I see my role is to kind of provide them with a broader piece of information to make that kind of informed decision.
And so I'm guessing that given your 14 years of experience in the space, you've seen selections or individuals that have been placed somewhere where that's worked and where it hasn't worked. And so you're drawing on that, you're providing your recommendation to your clients. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. So I mean, when you're working or when you operate in a kind of a area that is solely based around people. People are not always predictable. They don't always do exactly what you think they will do or what you
No.
would like them to do. Um, and equally as well, when you think there might be a negative outcome, people can really surprise you. So I think it's, whilst my key stakeholders will be looking at, I guess, their particular challenge, what they need in that individual, in the context of the business they're in the context of, I guess, the kind of strategy they've got, actually being able to provide them with a broader view, from my experience in different industries, with different operational levels of individuals. I think that can help make a more kind of informed decision. And that's always my driver. It's because, I do support differing levels of kind of stakeholders, within a business. And I think, for me, it's really about trying to give them as much information as possible to make that informed decision.
And so, what does a better conversation look like for you? What makes that a brilliant conversation when you've had it?
Yeah, great question. And I think certainly when we first spoke about me coming on the show, I was immediately sort of thinking, what does make a better conversation? And I've kind of concluded on a few elements. So for me, definitely a better conversation starts in a very calm place. And that enables both individuals or everyone, so whether it's one to one or in a group, to really share and be encouraged to share. So their thoughts, their experience, their opinions, without fear of, I guess, kind of criticism or it being dismissed from a kind of seniority perspective. But equally, I think everybody needs to, whether it's again one to one or in the group, they need to acknowledge that they may be kind of respectfully challenged on their opinion and their thoughts. So I think that's healthy. I think that's a healthy thing. Separating out the kind of sound and feel elements of your question. I as a as someone that really enjoys music and is an on-off player of a guitar, I liken
Yay!
conversation. Yeah, exactly. I liken conversation to a song. So you kind of almost have the intro, the verse, the bridge, the chorus, and then the verse, bridge, and the outro. It kind of has that flow, and I think that's what better conversation does sound like. So it can take you through a myriad of emotions, but I think the key thing is that you should never feel fearful or kind of intimidated to express your opinion, and you should always feel like you've moved forward after a conversation.
Yeah, I like your analogy with it being a piece of music because it is. There is a beginning, middle, and
Yeah,
end, right? And and sometimes there can be repeats of that. There'll be a beginning, middle, and end that starts a conversation that gets things going, and then you come back together and you go through it again and move. You become more aligned as you do. There's an interesting aspect to conversation that you touched on, which is being challenged and finding a place of being comfortable with that. It shouldn't be fearful, but there should be is it a tolerance or an acceptance or a because most of us find being challenged really quite difficult. And depending on who you're having the conversation with, it can be really uncomfortable, or it can be
yeah,
enjoyable.
I see. Yeah, yeah. So I think the key thing with respectfully challenging. Now I think that's something that you kind of can or should look to create within the culture of a business, the culture and the culture of the team. I think that's something that you kind of put into play, um, into that environment, so that everybody kind of understands that that it's something that can happen, and then the calibration comes between one to one or in the group in terms of what people are comfortable with, what people aren't comfortable with. So I think that should generate some openness. So hopefully I'm kind of getting to the nub of what you're looking for here. But if, like myself, you're quite introverted, you need to kind of almost not set your boundaries, but make people aware of ultimately what you're comfortable discussing. And equally, if you're quite an extroverted character, you need to be quite mindful that that may not be comfortable for everybody, and your approach to respectfully challenging may need to be almost again calibrated for the individual, the group that you're in. So I think that, yeah, there's the broader context of adopting that type of approach within a team, a business, so that everybody is aware that it's something that can and does happen, and then you find the calibration within the conversation itself.
And do you think, just a little bit of a challenge to you, I guess, is, do you think it's fair that someone who is an extrovert, say, should adjust their communication style in regard to, understanding who is around the table and who they're talking to? So, for example, if you've got an extroverted person talking to an introverted person, do you think it's a fair expectation that there might be an adjustment, and equally on the part of an introverted person as well towards the extroverted person? Do you think it's fair that we make adjustments, or should we just be who we are?
That's a fair question, and I think in response to that, it depends on how much you want to get out of the conversation. I think if you're really keen to get kind of rich information out of the conversation, if you really want to kind of make that connection with that individual to really make sure that it's a meaningful conversation, then yeah, you'll be thinking about that individual and how they receive and are comfortable to receive information. But I think, yeah, you're right. Should you have to adapt your style? No, there's no kind of mandate that you have to. But I think if you're indexing on your kind of EQ, and you really want to get a lot out of that conversation, you will be thinking about the audience and how they receive information.
I agree with you. I think if you want to get something out of
Mm.
the relationship or the connection with someone, we do need to make
Mm.
adjustments. And that comes down to our awareness of ourselves, right?
Yeah,
And
totally.
how we're showing up in a situation. And so I'm completely aligned to what you're saying. You can be yourself. That's perfectly fine, and no one's saying not to. But it's going to a deeper level with it,
Mm.
and thinking about, what do I want to get out of this interaction and this conversation.
Totally.
Um, so, Glenn, what would you say is your unique perspective on conversations, given that you talk to a lot of people, and you are scanning and trying to find a match between a culture and an individual?
Okay. So uh, I'll be honest, I don't think I have a unique perspective on conversations. I think perhaps because of the nature of what I do, I tend to analyze them more, and certainly be conscious of more things that surround the conversation, such as the environment, first and foremost, the individual, their kind of body language. I think the wider context of the conversation, if there is a wider context, is something I'm mindful of. Um, and certainly what I have observed of that person during the course of the day. Actually, sometimes I'll kind of be taking sort of mental notes of kind of office interaction, how people are kind of interacting during the course of the day, how specific individuals are kind of maybe how they appear in themselves during the course of the day. And that's something that I tend to draw on when I come to a conversation with them. So, in short, I think the importance of the conversation to them as well is is equally something that I'm mindful of, um, and I think also I think about, is this conversation a conversation in isolation, or is it a continuation of a particular dialogue, and how that kind of fits into the wider context of that person's, I guess, either agenda, or what they're driving towards, or what they're asking, or what they're looking for. So I think it's less a kind of unique perspective. It's a combination of observations that I have when I come into a conversation with an individual or group of individuals.
And I'm sure there's a lot about, a lot of subconscious readings, and a lot about how they make you feel or how you notice they make other people feel, whether that's a positive interaction or a awkward one.
Yeah, totally. I think, yeah, I yeah, I think the nature of what I do, and I don't mean this to sound weird, but I'm kind of continually observing people, and because my role is people focused, and so I'm observing individuals. So how they, how do they appear in the office before an interview? Because I'm thinking along the lines of, if they've had a quite stressful morning, will that go into the context of the interview, and how will that actually then bleed into the interview itself, and the individual that's being interviewed, what they will essentially experience in that interview. So there's a number of sort of things that I all the reasons why I'm kind of, I guess, health checking people during the course of the day.
Right.
Um,
Not to
so
make
yeah,
anyone feel uncomfortable now who might.
yes, yeah, of course. Now that this is going to get broadcast,
Yeah.
yeah, people will suddenly be, quite silent
But
when
I
I'm
think
around.
that's so true. I think when you are particularly when you're in an interview situation, that everything is that much more heightened, right?
Agreed. Yeah,
You are aware. Everyone's wanting to make the right choices and the right gauge of each other in both directions.
definitely. And
So
it's that kind of energy. So one of the things I also do, not just thinking from a kind of business that I'm working for and the people that I'm working with, from their perspective only, I also think about the individual that's coming in to interview. So whilst we're on that subject, so typically what I try and do is get that individual into the sort of office 15 to 20 minutes before the interview, just to have a sort of 5 to 10 minute, 15-minute chat with them, see how they are, how their energy is, see what their morning's been like. Because ultimately, if they've had a massively stressful morning and then they've had to rush and hurry to the interview, what kind of mindset are they in? Are they ready to be asked questions? Are they ready to kind of talk about themselves? Which is, more often than not the most comfortable place for everybody to be, right? Kind of going into an interview and sort of talking through your experience and your drivers and your motivations. And off the back of a massively stressful morning, sometimes what you need is just or what I try and offer is just a bit of kind of calibration before that, get their energy up, get their enthusiasm up, try and quell the nerves if there are nerves there, and just try and put a more sort of positive spin, so that ultimately when those two individuals meet for that interview, I know it's going to be a really positive conversation.
hmm. Well, you're setting them up for giving it their best shot.
Absolutely, yeah. Kind of creating a platform for them to really show the, not, it sounds a bit, the best version of themselves,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
certainly, the version that they would want to. I wouldn't want either party to kind of come out of that interview thinking, I didn't quite come across the way I would want to. I didn't quite provide the level of kind of energy, enthusiasm that I wanted to. I want it to be a really, really sort of positive meeting for both
Hmm.
parties.
That's brilliant. So, who has influenced you, Glenn, or shaped your perspective on conversations?
Oh wow! So immediately, I thought of three individuals when I looked at this particular question. So that's my wife, my best friend, and a former colleague, and somebody I'm very happy to call a friend, who happens to be a doctor in business psychology. So the way these three individuals certainly influence or shape my perspective on conversations. My wife, Bernadette, has influenced me and shaped my perspective on conversations, as she reminds me to just be me. So it's a an ongoing kind of joke in our house. She reminds me to kind of lose my radio voice. So when she hears me on calls and I sound a little too scripted or kind of overtly corporate, she reminds me to kind of connect on that human level, which I think is really valuable. Whilst, I mean, it actually, just her referencing the radio voice immediately kind of makes me laugh, and actually kind of relaxes me. So the next conversation, I'm sure, is always a lot more a lot more human.
So
Yeah, sure.
can I just interrupt you there and just ask, why do you think you adopt a
Yeah, that's
radio
a really good
voice?
question. I think certainly certainly part of my role, I get asked questions that are quite consistent. So people want to know about, kind of the composition of the job, some of the deliverables. They want to know more about the company. And I think by going through information that is, there and ready and quantifiable, I think there might be a danger that it does sound a little too scripted, and not particularly kind of rounded at the edges. So, when I'm kind of talking through stats and, kind of geographies and, kind of revenue targets, etc., they're they're factual, but they're quite kind of hard statistics. So that's where I think that the radio voice comes through. So
Right.
yeah, it's a good reminder to me, as I said, when Bernie kind of sort of says, "I heard the radio voice there." I kind of think, right, next call, let's just round the edges a little bit. Um, so on to Diego, who's my best friend. He's influenced my approach to conversations because he is so generous in conversation. He is certainly somebody that's shown me the importance of making others feel like their opinions are valued through active listening. I mean, he's I don't know whether that's a conscious or unconscious thing with him. He's just always done it, and just kind of seeing him, certainly in kind of friend situations where he's introduced to new people, and certainly having worked with him and seeing him in a business context, I know that that's consistent. That's something he just does naturally. So he's a very good kind of it's a very good kind of role model to me
Right.
in terms of that active listening piece. And then to Dr. Tim. So as I said, Dr. Tim is a kind of former colleague and now close friend. He's certainly influenced me through improving my active engagement in conversations. So what I mean by that is it's conversational stamina. So challenging me not to lapse into kind of lazy conversation topics when you're kind of meeting people the first time. Kind of talk about weather, sport, general news topics. He reminds me to really seek the value in that conversation for that person and for me, which I think is a really really important thing.
And that, Glenn, that shows through the influence that those three people, how they've influenced you, does show up. So, I know in first few times of meeting you, you're focused, you're present, you're very much there in the conversation, and you are always asking, deeper questions. You delve into a topic or response. Um, so it's really nice, and it's nice because it makes us feel valued, right? It makes us feel like we have a point of view that someone's interested in or is important, and it's validated.
Absolutely, and thank you for that feedback. Yeah, it's something that I think is really important. Every conversation is important. I think every conversation, every interaction is important. And yeah, like you said, and you've said it so correctly there. It's being present in that conversation, and that not kind of drifting away, or kind of not being an active participant in the conversation. I think yeah,
Yeah,
it's really important
yeah.
to be very present.
And conversation stamina is a really great way
Mm.
to put it, because it is that. I mean, it really is, not allowing yourself to kind of drift off and think, okay, where do I have to be next? But actually stay with the conversation, have a genuine interest, right, in what the other person is saying, so that you can ask more and more questions, that you can stay with that person. And that it takes practice, just like a sport, just like any sort of activity where it requires, it's a bit of an endurance sport maybe sometimes, but I think it's stamina is a
Yeah.
great way
Yeah,
to
it
refer
is. I
to
mean,
it.
and
Yeah.
it does take, it does practice. But it requires you to be present in every conversation. It requires you to really kind of be active listening, listening to what that individual's saying. Kind of taking on board their opinions, and really, kind of trying to, increase the quality of that conversation, because it is so easy to, you know, certainly when you've met, say for instance, in the context of meeting somebody for the first time, so easy to lapse into those conversations around, weather, sport, etc., and not actually really ask some not probing questions to be, kind of overtly sort of personal, but just trying to really engage that individual, understand what's interesting to them, and oftentimes you have a context immediately, when a conversation starts, whether it's work related, whether it's personal. It's just really about how you approach that and how you get that momentum behind that conversation.
Well, it makes it memorable, right? And if you've actually asking questions that do go a little bit deeper and not autopilot type questions, you are more likely to remember things about that individual
Totally indeed,
that
yeah.
are important to them. What's the best conversation you've ever had?
Well, that's a really difficult question to answer, because that would require distilling so many conversations down to just one, and I think it would be very challenging to recall just one.
So what would be the elements of those conversations?
So yeah, I think the common themes through those conversations, or certainly one of the key common themes, is learning something new about that individual that's important to them. I think that's one of the key elements of the best conversations I've had, and they can range, in the kind of emotional spectrum. Some can be quite challenging, very emotional. Some can be, all the way through to very humorous. But I think that, I guess, the key thing for me personally is when the conversation has been, kind of concluded. There's an increased understanding, and thereby an increased human connection. And I think that comes back to, the sort of previous question around kind of active listening and conversational stamina. But I do think, just to kind of reiterate, that you know, you know getting that understanding, or getting to that point of understanding what's important to that individual, and that increased understanding of them is is one of the sort of key things from a really great conversation.
Yeah. And so on the other end of the spectrum, then what are the things that would mean you end up defining that conversation as probably the worst
Ooh.
conversation ever?
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, not every conversation is really positive, right? So, and I have had some very challenging conversations in my time in recruitment, and I think that the ones that, make it a really negative conversation is where you just have highly irrational emotion. So it's just kind of, it's off the spectrum compared to the sort of topic, or the kind of subject you're talking about, where the individual is really overtly kind of emotional, or actually on the other side, where they're dismissive of even engaging in a conversation. It's almost like a couple of quick sound bites and the conversation's over. And I think this manifests either in a level of aggression, or passive aggressive approach. I mean, it's just not comfortable kind of conversation to be in. But I think I'll caveat that, in so much as, on occasion, I think I may have failed to read that person, and maybe their kind of level of anxiety around the conversation topic. They may have deemed the topic confrontational, and I haven't read that correctly, and that could have led to their slightly dismissive behaviour or kind of increased emotion. So I'm always looking for the learning in a conversation, whether it's a positive or negative. I think there's always a learning in there for me. So whilst it's never nice to be in a really sort of tough, challenging conversation, I think there's always a learning to be taken from it.
And have you had opportunities after conversations like that to reconnect with that individual or have another go at the conversation?
Yeah, I always attempt to, because I think if you've had a really challenging or tough conversation, that's usually not the end
Mm.
of the conversation. That's probably just a kind of,
Mm.
I guess I don't know, a line's been drawn, or almost a preliminary kind of conclusion or decision has been drawn. But I think I certainly always try and re-engage and get that back to a place of kind of a sort of positive conversation or positive engagement. Um,
I think what's interesting is that we can often leave conversations
mm,
in a stalemate, and then revisiting that conversation, going back and catching up with someone and say, "Hey, can we try that again?" Doesn't happen, but
mhm.
it's always an option to open to us to actually find that person and say, "Hey, I didn't feel like that meeting or that conversation went very well. Did I miss something? Was there something going on that I was there? Was I, was I being completely obtuse and not seeing what you were trying to communicate? Can we have another go at it?" And so that's a sort of step that we often abandon. We just have a rubbish conversation with someone, and it's left at that. And then future conversations, have that as the history rather than a repair of that conversation, which actually can improve your relationship, can improve the connection massively, because you've actually both experienced something of high emotion, right? And to have moved past it means you've got a shared experience of getting through something that's uncomfortable, which can improve conversations, relationships remarkably.
Absolutely. And I think I should have answered that question exactly like that.
Well, we're aligned. That's the important
Exactly,
thing, Glenn.
exactly. And just to add to that, I do think that sometimes you may go back into that conversation and the outcome or decision may be the same, but actually it's kind of acknowledged in a slightly more kind of calmer, rational way. I think, you're almost looking to sort of sense check that decision is the right decision. You may disagree with it, but certainly in that kind of heightened state of emotion, it's I think it's important just to kind of revisit it when both parties are calmer, and and then, like I say, acknowledge, okay, a decision has been made, and we've concluded that, and actually we've agreed it in a slightly sort of calmer setting, and I think that's a positive outcome, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so important for a couple of reasons come to mind. One is some of us need a little bit longer to sit with an idea, right? And consider what we think about that. And we can feel ambushed if we have to respond there and then, right? We might have a feel that it's not quite right, but we can't quite name what's going on and why we feel it's not quite right. And secondly, the fact that you go back and have another attempt at the conversation, it shows positive intention, right? You are actually wanting something better to come out of it, and you can actually state what you just said, which is, um, you know, it would be great if we were aligned and we can reach agreement, but we may not. And that is important to state as well, right? That we're not always going to agree. It's not always going to be a united decision. And but how we get behind a decision and move forward with it is really important. So you're not being dismissive of their voice.
Totally agree. Totally.
Mhm. So, in talking about always learning, Glenn, what would be What would you say is your worst habit in conversations?
Oh, this is so easy, Sehaam. And it's certainly something I'm continuing to work on. And it's my over enthusiasm to introduce information and an opinion, which some would interpret as just straightforward interrupting, basically. As a so let me just kind of provide some context. As I referenced earlier, I certainly can't class myself as a slightly more introverted soul as opposed to an extrovert, and I think I spent what felt like so many years struggling to find my voice, even though I felt I had sound opinions and knowledge to share, and it just kind of came from a place of being quite introverted and quite shy, if I'm honest, and now that's kind of manifest itself in, as I said, that excitement to share information, and feeling free to do so. That I find myself kind of agreeing with people and then very quickly adding information in, and I think it does come across sometimes as me just kind of jumping the gun in terms of the flow, the give and take of a conversation. So it's something I'm acutely aware of, and something I'm definitely continuing to work on.
Well, and as an introverted person, I think it's actually really helpful. It's a great way of getting out of this sort of self-consciousness that we have sometimes, by actually thinking about what's the context, what's my remit here, what's the topic that we need to be discussing. So I think you can be allowed the few interruptions because you are actually generating, dialogue and getting a conversation going where maybe once upon a time that would have been quite hard to do.
Yeah, exactly that. I think it's interesting that you can read individuals' body language and kind of facial expressions when you kind of overstep the mark. I think with kind of interrupting, it's something that it helps me kind of sense check myself.
So how do people respond sometimes when you know that you've interrupted too many times?
It's a combination of a couple of things. It's either kind of a slight raise of the eyebrows, a kind of deep drawing of the breath, sort of like, okay, continue. So it's a combination of those two things that typically are the sort of warning lights for me to just sort of say, okay, Glenn, take a step back and just kind of breathe a bit more air into the conversation. Let it open up a bit more.
So what do you reckon gets in the way of a conversation?
Well, I think there's kind of three things in my experience that I think always kind of get in the way of a really good conversation. That's a real specific personal agenda. So if you're arriving at a conversation, not even thinking about the audience, not even thinking about realistically what their opinions or response may be, you just want to get the agreement that you want. That's not a conversation, in my opinion. I think a high degree of stubbornness to acknowledge another individual's kind of opinion, or just stubbornness or dismissiveness, and ego as well, which kind of can manifest itself in a number of different ways. But yeah, those three things for me, I think, definitely get in the way of a good conversation because they're not open, they're not generous, they're not engaging, and they're not thinking about all parties in the conversation. They're quite singular. They're quite directed from that
Right.
individual only and from their perspective only.
Yeah, and they're not taking responsibility for making sure that their audience is ready to receive them. This is something I talk about a lot to clients. Is we are responsible for making sure that the airwaves are open, right? That they are ready to receive, that they want to talk to you, they want to hear what you have to say. And if you don't have that awareness, if you're not thinking about, um, the audience you're trying to influence or get buy-in from, you can go with your ego and you can go with the a position that you feel really strongly about, but you won't get people backing you. You won't get people in your corner. You won't build advocates and supporters for what it is that you're trying to do. So ultimately, what's more important here? Is it to move something forward, or is it to express your point of view strongly?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it does. It builds, it builds barriers between people, and that's never a good thing.
Tell me, what do people enjoy about conversations with you?
So I think they will probably be quite aware that I listen. I ask questions, and I'm certainly always ensure that that individual or group of individuals has my complete attention. And I think if you feel like you're in a conversation where the other individual or individuals are doing that, I think you feel more empowered to share those opinions and know they'll be respected and received, and as I said, come back to my point around respectfully challenged.
Yeah. Tell me about you. You talked about being humorous, sometimes unintentionally. Why don't you explain?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't consider myself to be a particularly humorous person. I think most of the kind of humor I inject into a conversation is probably unintentional. Just purely sometimes because I go off on an excitable tangent about a particular subject, or I make an observation that could be quite amusing to the other individual. And actually, when I realise that I've made somebody laugh, actually it's not a narcissistic thing. It just actually amuses me as well. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Humour in a conversation is always
Yay!
good, right?
Yes. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, and I think it's just the delight, isn't it? That if we did end up making someone laugh unintentionally, that's not a bad thing, right? That's a lovely thing to bring into the energy. So,
totally,
yeah.
totally indeed. Because I am awful at telling jokes. Really awful. The delivery is just so poor.
Yeah.
So
Can you remember jokes, Glenn?
no, not at all.
So
That's
someone
a
puts
bit.
you on the spot. Glenn,
Uh,
tell us a joke.
yeah, exactly. I mean, there would just be a long pause.
Uh, so, what do you think is, or what do you feel is critical for people to understand your perspective?
Okay, so I'm not entirely sure that you can get everybody to understand your perspective. I
Mm.
think that's almost like trying to force an agenda into a conversation. So, say, take a subject as volatile as political party allegiances.
Hmm.
So, one of my really good friends, Patrick, and I, or Paddy, we debate or have debated um, political subjects previously, and we are absolutely polar opposites on most things relating to anything political. Um, so I don't expect him to fully understand my perspective, but I would like to think that he respects my perspective. Well, I know he does. So in a context of a conversation with a colleague or a senior stakeholder, we may differ on our perspectives, but I think that there does need to be that underlying respect, because ultimately that will get us to a point of actually getting a sort of positive conclusion from the conversation.
Mm. Hmm.
So if I can give you a kind of a work context example of that.
Hmm.
So a hiring manager may not fully understand why I think they need to make an offer to an individual, because from their perspective, which is different, they may be thinking about the results in the next 3 months. They may be thinking about the workload in the next 3 months, and they may be thinking about the level of capability they need in that next 3 months. Whereas I'm actually thinking about the next 9 to 12 months. I'm thinking about that person's growth potential, how they can deliver maybe 65, 70, 75% of the deliverables we're looking for now, and their growth potential to hit that sort of 100%. And equally, I'm thinking about the overall kind of cultural fit. So it's like I say, the perspectives may be different, but I think there does need to be that respect for us to get to a point where we can make a final decision that is fully considered.
And it's a balance, isn't it? It's the needs, immediate needs is kind of what I heard you say. Typically for someone, wanting that new hire to start as soon as possible, they've got a deep need immediately to sort, and so that's the focus. So what you're bringing to the picture is, okay, well, that's great, they can deliver that, but we also need to think about, are they the right fit for us as a longer term, because it's an investment, right? It's an investment on both sides.
Absolutely. So yeah.
In the
Yeah,
relationship.
absolutely. I think you've nailed it specifically there. I mean, it is an investment. So, you may want that person to come in and kind of deliver against what you need them to do, and you need that 100% capability now. But after that 3-month period, what about that individual's growth potential? If they can deliver against all of the capability in that you require, all the deliverables you require from them, what does what does beyond 3 months look like for them? More of the same? That's not particularly challenging as a career step, is it? Going into a role that you can fully deliver against, what do you learn? Where's your growth potential? Where's your career ladder? And I think, that for me is, that consideration is, it has to be broader. It has to be broader.
Right. And will they want to stay, right? So,
Well, yeah,
that works for 3 months, but will they want to be
exactly.
here beyond that initial need?
Exactly.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
totally.
So, Glenn, this has been great, great conversation. I've got one last question for you, which is, what would you leave listeners with?
Okay, great. Well, listen, first and foremost, this has been really enjoyable. Sehaam, I was really excited to go on and talk to you. It's always a great conversation with you.
Thank you.
But certainly in answer in answer to your question, so I would say to listeners, be a student of conversation in all aspects of your life. Don't be a lazy listener or just a sort of general conversationalist. I would say, certainly think about your conversational stamina, being an active listener, because I think human interaction is the most valuable and enjoyable aspect of everyday life, and we are all better for it in both our personal and business life.
I couldn't agree more, Glenn. Thank you so much. This has been brilliant.
Thank you, Sehaam. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Better Conversations with me, Sehaam Cyrene. You'll find show notes at sehaamcyrene.com/podcast, including more information about my guest, Glenn Martin. Have you listened to previous episodes? What do you think? What do you enjoy? And what would you like to hear more of? Do drop me a line, podcast@sehaamcyrene.com. You'll find all episodes on Apple Podcast and Spotify, so I do hope you'll subscribe. If you agree with Glenn and I that human interaction is one of the most valuable and enjoyable aspects of everyday life, perhaps you'll consider his advice. Be a student of conversation and don't be lazy. Instead, invest in building your conversation stamina. Until next time, I'm Sehaam Cyrene, and this has been a Better Conversation.